Political scene and the key lessons for Uganda. Today, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, took a final step on the Kenyan situation, confirming charges against 4 persons and exonerating 2 others who had all been implicated for planning and executing the attacks that led to bloodshed in post-election Kenya. ICC presiding judge announced the chamber found that there are substantial grounds to believe William Ruto is responsible as an indirect perpetrator of the crimes. She also confirmed charges against Uhuru Kenyatta, who is accused of having ties with a Kenyan criminal gang called the Mungiki. It was alleged that Kenyatta had directed these gangs to attack opposition supporters. Now, both Ruto and Kenyatta were seen as leading challengers to Prime Minister Raila Odinga in the next presidential election, which is due to be held by March 2013 at the very latest. Cabinet Secretary Francis Muthaura and radio presenter Joshua Arap Sang, an Odinga loyalist, will also be prosecuted. The former head of police, Mohamed Hussein, and former minister Henry Kosgei were exonerated. What began as political riots soon turned into ethnic killings targeting Kenyatta's Kikuyu tribe, leading to the death of at least 1,200 people, prompting an investigation that led to the indictment and the subsequent confirmation of the charges today. The debate in Kenya has now taken a deeper dimension, with some members of the political class wondering if at all the current President Mwai Kibaki and Prime Minister Raila Odinga are totally clean, since they were the leaders of the 2 sides at the center of the conflict, fueled by an election they had both contested in. The Kenyan situation is a key point of reference to leaders and journalists and radio presenters in Uganda and beyond about the huge responsibility that they bear. We will therefore reflect tonight on the genesis of the violence, the intervention by the ICC, and how the political landscape in Kenya will shape up as elections get. Also, our guests tonight, Mr. Gwada Ogot, a Kenyan political pundit, a journalist and human rights activist. You're most welcome, Mr. Ogot.
Good evening, the members of the public.
Mr. Nicholas Opiyo is our second guest. He's a legal consultant at AKIJUL, also a commentator on political and social issues. You're most welcome, Nicholas.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edmond, and good evening to all the listeners and those who are viewing us online.
Let's reflect on the roots of this. Mr. Ogot, you had an eyewitness account of how the post-election violence started, 2007 spilling over into 2008, and the factors that fueled this violence that went across regions. 1,200 people killed, 200,000 displaced. How did it all begin?
Thank you very much. Kenya is a highly fractured society ethnically, and this has its roots largely from the independence celebrations in 1963. There has been a feeling that a cabal, an ethnic cabal, had entrenched itself around the center of power and gotten undue control over and access to land, had also taken over complete control of the finance sector, the energy sector, the civil service, and the security apparatus. Now, this caused a situation where there were certain politicians who would, the sense of impunity that had been expressed became almost wanton. Now, in the cause of this, an ethnic divide arose that clearly pitted 3 groups against each other. On one hand, there was the Kenyatta family and largely the Kikuyu behind them. 2, there was the second President Moi and the Kalenjin speakers. And 3, there was the Odingas, who were in intent and purposes Luo, but that is in quotes. Now, after Odinga worked with Kenyatta for 2 years at independence, they fell out.
The father of Raila Odinga.
The father of Raila Odinga.
That's Oginga Odinga.
Oginga Odinga.
Yes.
And after falling out, Odinga withdrew into an ethnic cocoon and sought solace from his ethnic group. Kenyatta also, as pressure grew on him nationally, also recoiled into his ethnic cocoon, who he planted and gave exclusive and planned positions in government, and thus giving them access to allergies that was unknown in the country. Now,
giving them access to
state resources,
yes.
And in many ways, people felt that that was against or given at the expense of other communities in the country. Now, by year 2012, we will have had 2 Kikuyu presidents who have ruled for 24 years. Combined. And we'll have a Kalenjin leader in Moi who had ruled for also 24 years. So that creates a stalemate of 24 years balancing the 48 years of the nation. Now, the outside group that had been mobilizing was the Odinga faction, who had been mobilizing and mutating through various parties, from Oginga Odinga's KPU to Oginga Odinga's National Kenya Social Congress, finally to Ford Kenya, and then finally to the younger Odinga, who then formed the National Development Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, and finally ODM, which is the current Orange Democratic Movement. Now, those events largely define the forces that were pitted in the 2007 elections. The Odingas felt their time had come, but the Mois and the Kenyatta or the Kikuyu elite had ganged up on one side. But there was always a tribal edge to this, which I need to clearly put forward. It almost appeared that at every election since the commencement of multi-party politics, there was always what you'd call the enemy tribe. In 2002, it was the Luo and the Kikuyu against the Kalenjin, who are Moi's people. In 2007, it was the Luo and the Kalenjin against the Kikuyu, who are Kibaki's people.
The alliances had changed.
The alliances had shifted, but that has been the shift consistently. Now, what happened in during the by-election was largely not unexpected. It was documented. It was spoken about in advance. I did that on various radio stations, on Citizen TV, where I was an analyst, and a lot of other people did the same in regard to this. Now, finally, when it got down to the election, many people thought that Kibaki had largely not taken action on an issue that he could see coming, and that probably his nemesis Odinga had also taken advantage of the situation. But again, in regard to these balances, they also what comes into play in regard as you view the Kenyan thing is the rise of Barack Obama to the presidency of the United States of America. Yeah.
And he's a Luo.
He is a Luo ethnic group.
Yes.
And many people have thought that also shifted the pendulum in terms of giving the Luo greater access, sympathy, and a voice in trying to reclaim a place within the state apparatus in the country. And that finally there had to be some order, or there was a big brother watching who would stamp his foot down and say, can we get some order in the house? Now, when you look at 207, many people say that there are suspects whose names and identities have been raised today, the 4 individuals.
Yes.
Uhuru, the son of Kenyatta.
Yes.
Ruto, you would say a political orphan of Moi, from Moi's Kalenjin group.
Yes.
Then there is Sang, who is a radio presenter from a Kalenjin radio station.
Yes.
And then finally there is Mr. Mudaura, who interestingly, Mr. Mudaura is the secretary to the cabinet. He is the private secretary to the president, and he is also the permanent secretary in the office of the president.
Very high position.
Very high position.
And the chairman of the security.
Of the security council, and only receives instructions from one man, the president. But on the other hand, Ruto also is the deputy leader officially of the ODM party, and largely also would say also receives instructions from only one man, his party boss, who is the prime minister, though they do not cope. But that gives you a structural purview of what exists, and then where the buck may ultimately stop. Because you will find that while there has been focus on individual blame, there has been absolutely no focus on institutional blame, because the institutions that fought in 2007 still exist. It was ODM versus PNU.
Right.
I mean, they cross over into ethnic groups, so you cannot say that it was purely a Kalenjin, Kikuyu, and Luo affair.
Right.
I mean, that would be wrong, because they are institutions that fought and they still exist.
Right.
Now the question is, will this process aggravate old wounds, or will it help the healing process of the nation? That would be a perspective to look at.
Interesting. Spectrum. This is Spectrum on Radio, and tonight the ICC takes a final stand on Kenya's horror suspects. What are the implications of the Kenyan political scene and the key lessons for Uganda? Our guest tonight, Mr. Gwada Ogot, we've just had him speak. Kenyan political pundit, journalist and human rights activist, and Mr. Nicholas Opiyo. Mr. Opiyo, do we have parallels with Uganda?
Well, first and foremost, if you say the ICC has taken a final stand, I don't think that's a final stand. I think that what has happened today is that a confirmation hearing has delivered a ruling to the effect that the 4 gentlemen whose names, have been mentioned, have capability in terms of being the perpetrators or indeed co-financers of what happened in Kenya in 2007. So what has happened is not the final judgment. It is a confirmation hearing, which in effect now says these 4 gentlemen are going to have to face the court and be tried. Secondly, on a lighter note, I think Gwada is now an East African analyst, not just a Kenyan pundit. He's been here. He's done a lot of work on electoral democracy in Uganda, and we've got to underscore that. That's important for us. But in terms of parallels, I think what happened in Kenya is really the same thing that has happened in many East African countries. The fact that the hopes that were raised after independence were quickly dashed because of certain, governance issues. You have predominantly civilian post-independent leaders who, instead of harnessing the hope and carrying forward African countries to the next step, breaking down or going down into alliances and creating ethnic groups and entrenching that and using it to their own advantage. I mean, in Uganda, you know that the army in Uganda was predominantly people from the north. And so you have people from the north who thought that they had grip on power. It was their thing. It's not for the others. So that then goes ahead from independence. It's carried forward until about 1980, 86, in which then the power shifts to a guy from the south. And in the middle you have the north and south divide. They complain about our thing, and that's giving rise to rebel groups like the UNLA in the north in 1987. So the same thing has been happening in Uganda. The only difference is that the one in Uganda has not broken out to the level it did in Kenya. And I can tell you this, I'm not a prophet of doom, but I can predict that if we go down the same line and not change the path of our democratic journey, Uganda might experience the same thing. It has happened in Rwanda, it has happened in Kenya, it is simmering in Tanzania and Uganda. It can explode anytime. So there are lessons to learn from that. Address the question of ethnic divide, address the question of cocooning into smaller tribal groups, and begin to look at national interest if you're to build this country and carry it forward and avoid a relapse into conflict that we've seen in Kenya and in Rwanda.
What are we doing that could lead us to that line?
There are several things. The key sectors of the economy, in Uganda, I can tell you, of the state, is in the hands, or allegedly is in the hands of a few from a particular region. These statements have been made before, that the army general, the security apparatus, look at the police, look at the army, the UPDF, look at prisons, look at intelligence services, are being headed and manned by people who have the same origin. At one point was from the same village. Okay?
At one point
was guys from the same village commanding all these 5 sectors. Look at the economy. Key sectors of the economy. The Bank of Uganda. You can argue that the Ministry of Finance, but I think the minister is a political appointment. It's not something significant. But the guys who call the shots. You've had arguments about employees of URA. You've had arguments about UPDF generals. These are signs of tensions that, if you don't address, might cause this kind of problems you saw in Kenya. I can go on, the list is long, but the same thing is entirely reflected here in Uganda. That particular key sectors of the state are held by a particular group of people and a particular niche or group or clique of people.
Okay.
And those are symptoms of what happened in Kenya and might actually boil over.
And you said what happened in Rwanda as well.
Exactly.
All right. Let's talk about these trials, possibly being signature trials. These were men behind the scenes. They never held machetes. The people who actually killed, the 1,200 people, are down there in the villages walking scot-free. And there's also a feeling that there were men behind these ones. These are signature trials. How effective are they in ending crime?
That's a moot question. It's a question that only time will answer. But what I can tell you now is that the principle of referring cases to the ICC is that you cannot try everybody, really. The ICC will focus on people who had command responsibility, people who had control over these groups, leaving the bigger bulk of the individual persons who carried the machete, who went and raped women, to be tried by national processes. You're never going to have all of these guys going to be tried by the ICC. So the logic is that the people, if you like, the foot soldiers, are left to national processes. And in instances where the national process cannot or is unwilling to try people with command responsibility, then the ICC will try them. What this therefore does is, it may not necessarily mark an end to Kenya's problem, but sends out a strong message that might deter future occurrence of things that happened in 2007.
All right.
So it's majorly symbolic, I think, in my view.
You may explain it very, very well there. Let's look at the other side now, the upstream, if you like. If that was the downstream, the people carried machetes. Let's talk about the upstream of it. Where does the buck actually stop? Where does it stop?
I think from the structural layout that I had given you, that one of the leaders is the deputy leader of the Orange Democratic Movement, and the other is the Raila Odinga, and the other is the secretary. Is the private secretary and secretary to the cabinet, and also permanent secretary to the president. Tells you where the buck actually stops. But in relation, if you nuance the two between the Kenyan and Ugandan situations, the politics are so interlinked. I think in the last 2 years, or 1 year and a half, you have seen almost 6 or 7 presidential candidates from Kenya visit Uganda for various forms of consultation.
Yes.
And you've also seen various leaders from Uganda, I think about 2 opposition leaders, and the president also visit Kenya for consultations. Now, this is not something that regularly happens between Uganda and Tanzania, nor does it happen between Kenya and Tanzania, but specifically happens between Uganda and Kenya. Now, that gives you a very strong linkage between the two nations in terms of direction and perspectives of politics and relations too. 3, in regard to the East Africa region, most of these issues that we are discussing today take various forms in terms of their political application. All the 5 East Africa regions, including nations, including the youngest nation in the world, South Sudan, have undergone referenda. And all the referenda in this region have been constitutional in nature. So it means that there are certain underlying issues which the peoples of these nations have been trying to resolve through a referenda process. But there's only one unfortunate thing, that all the referenda have been marked or followed by violence. The Kenya violence of 2007 was preceded by the referenda of 2005. Tanzania, for the first time in its history, held a national referenda. And by the end of the year, when they were holding the elections, they had the worst electoral violence ever in their history. Burundi, which has had great problems with governance and democracy, has had about 4 referenda or 5 referenda in its entire history. Rwanda the same. But all the referenda have been of a constitutional nature. The net result is that Kenya has finally come up with a draft constitution which is being implemented bits and pieces, in stages. But the worrying aspect is this trend is anything to go by. What therefore does it mean that you have a transition period where you're moving from an old constitution to a new constitution? Yes. At the same time you are in an election year. What happens? Does it bode well for the nation?
Right.
Or is there going to be a storm before you finally get a still again?
Right.
I mean, those are key issues to look at.
Right. Can you give us the scenario? What could happen or what is likely to happen? I'd like you to answer the same question for us as well.
There are various aspects that I'd wish to look at when you look at a process of this nature, particularly in relation to the unfolding political scenario. One, you will look at key institutions that participate in or around elections. One is the Electoral Commission. The Kenyan Electoral Commission has already been completely transformed with a new name, new membership, new modes of employment or recruitment, amongst others. That is one. 2, you look at the judiciary. The judiciary has also been completely transformed with new modes of employment, new people coming in, and the old is being shed. 3, you will look at its impact on political parties. I mean, for example, today, there's a Political Parties Act in Kenya that is extremely clear about how parties should be run, funding of political parties, the elbow room. It defines the elbow room within for the political leaders to operate in. And the big question now is, therefore, if for example, Ruto has been called in, will he be able to go for a seat in his new political party that he formed, the United Republican Party? Will Uhuru Kenyatta be able to again run or be confirmed as the presidential candidate for his own party first before he declares his ultimate presidential bid? Will Raila Odinga, based on the kind of flack he's taking, because Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto have clearly stated in the preliminary hearings of the ICC that they blame the violence of 2007 on the Prime Minister, and they are doing, if they are charged currently, as has been confirmed, they will do everything to try and either get him on board, incriminate him, or do everything to stop him.
Is there a likelihood for that to happen?
You see, currently there's been two schools of thought here, that Odinga is a head of government, Kibaki is a head of state,
yes.
So they're insulated. But somebody then quickly asks, what about the Bashir case? But as we know, really, international law and international politics, it's clear there, but most of the time it's about, there's a lot of double standards, some of the things you cannot rationalize. So ultimately, there are lessons for the whole of East Africa to learn from. But one thing that it curbs clearly, particularly in the Kenyan scenario, is that wanton sense of impunity, that I can do what I want and get away with it. I can steal what I want and get away with it.
Or even theft.
I can kill who I want and get away with it. That, I mean, in Uganda there's a system that still works. I see some of the big fish still go to prison.
Right.
I see a sense of a legal system that still works. Uganda has not lost its conscience. I mean, it still has a conscience. Maybe it is degenerating or it could be losing, but Uganda as a nation has not lost its conscience. Certain systems still work, and the divide between the rich and the class divide in Uganda is not as massive as it is in Kenya.
Yeah.
Right.
In Kenya, it is clearly massive, and as one professor put it last week, Professor Mwangi, he said really the situation in Kenya is purely a fight, a class war between the rich and the poor. I mean, there's no shortcut to it.
Let Julius Nyerere call it a man-eating man society. We'll be back. Please stay tuned.
Fellow Ugandans, the United Nations has declared that access to the internet is a universal human right, along with access to water and food. Like the UN, we believe that every Ugandan should enjoy this right. We believe that access to information, education, and improved communication through the internet will build this great nation. And it is because of what we so strongly believe that we are giving every single MTN customer 10 megabytes of free data on their mobiles. And everyone can start experiencing it now.
Follow us on facebook.com/MTNUG or twitter.com/MTNUgandaCare. This announcement was brought to you by MTN.
Choosing a career for your future can at times be a daunting task. But when you choose Cyprus International University, you get a high-quality education for a brighter career. Bring your academic certificate for on-spot admission and seminars in Uganda at the following dates and meet Professor Dr. Rustem Onkar, the Cyprus International University Admissions Director. Kampala Seminar on the 21st of January at Raja Chambers, Parliamentary Avenue at 10 a.m. Ginger Town Seminar on the 23rd of January at Sunset International Hotel at 10 a.m. Mbarara Seminar on the 24th of January at Classic Hotel, Main Street, Mbarara at 10 a.m. And on the 25th of January, another Kampala Seminar at Hotel Triangle, Uganda Road at 10 a.m. Find Cyprus International University online on www.ciu.edu.tr.
John, Mike and I, we go back a bit. We knew John at the beginning, working for someone else. But he was different. He had vision, saw opportunities. He started working towards his goal, opened his own garage, and worked, learning the hard way. His reputation spread. Trust, consistency, quality. Soon people were coming to him from all parts. He made himself and his whole street prosper, and also helped friends, seeing potential in people and helping them on. But John never shouts about all his success. He is just who he is. Special.
So here's to men like John, who make a difference, who enjoy Nile Special, the rich, satisfying taste from the source. Nile Special. You've earned it.
Not for sale to persons under 18.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90 is brought to you by Stanbic Bank.
Welcome back on Spectrum. Tonight, the ICC takes a stand on the an important stand on the Kenya horror suspects. What are the implications of the Kenyan political scene and key lessons for Uganda? Our guest tonight, Mr. Gwada Ogot, East Africa Regional Political Pundit, journalist and human rights activist, and Mr. Nicholas Opiyo, legal consultant at AKIJUL, also a commentator on political and social issues. You'll be able to contribute to this discussion a little bit later. Nicholas, give us your view of the scenario. What could happen in court?
Well, the trial of the 4 people obviously has to commence. And once this trial commences, there are going to be 3 issues that I think are going to come up. The first is the overall responsibility of the head of government and the head of state in Kenya, Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga.
Their names are going to be drawn to the floor.
It is definitely going to be an issue, because the reason the ICC put these 2 cases in 2 separate files. It's not one file.
Yes.
There are 2 separate files
reflecting
the 2 different divides in 2007. The Kibaki divide and the Raila divide. So this trial is essentially a trial of these 2 divides, and the heads and leaders of this divide are no doubt going to be dragged into this matter. I foresee a situation where there might actually be need for further investigation with a view of bringing to book Raila Odinga and Mwai Kibaki when they leave government. Because I think that this decision to leave them out was purely a political decision to try and maintain Kenya's stability and avoid further bloodshed. The ultimate question is the role of the leaders of these 2 groups. The second thing, which I think is more important, is that it has forever changed the contours of Kenyan politics. Because I think that the prosecutor, in his view, might seek to have them detained to avoid interference with witnesses and court processes.
Let's get that clearly. William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta, together with the other 2, they could be detained in The Hague.
They could be detained.
Right now, the situation is they are not detained until the trial begins. Until they are convicted. They are still free men, even though this announcement was made today.
They have an equivalent of what you call a bail in national system. They are out there free, but have promised to go to court when and if they're needed.
Right.
But if in the view of the prosecutor, I think under Article 58 or 53, I think, of the Rome Statute, they have a possibility of them interfering with witnesses and court process, he could apply to the pretrial chamber to have them detained.
In The Hague.
In The Hague. So if you have a situation where the 2 leaders are detained, that extinguishes their ambition to contest for elections in Kenya in the first place, because they are physically absent. Secondly, it does send a strong message, I think, across East Africa, that the amount of impunity, the amount of thuggery that has been witnessed in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Uganda, electoral theft, which is accompanied by outright violence, has no place in modern politics. And if you do so, the whole world is going to come down hard on you.
So it could clean up our politics in the region.
It's going to go a long way in reintroducing some sense into electoral process.
So people could actually begin to lose elections and concede for the sake of their families and their own skin.
Well, they may not concede losing elections, but what they won't do is to go down the road of violence, to go down the road of ethnic cleansing. That is never going to happen in this part of the world.
And their money is not going to be a savior at all. Uhuru Kenyatta is one of the richest Africans, $500 million worth.
You see, the Rome Statute is a very interesting statute. It provides, I think, under Article 25, that one's position in government cannot be a bar to criminal trial before the ICC. For as long as you're found culpable, you will be tried, irrespective of how much money you have or what position in government you occupy.
And some of this wealth could be seized to appease some of the people who bore the brunt of the violence.
Among the orders the courts can make are orders of compensation and restitution. So there is a possibility that they will be asked to compensate.
Actually, they have been asked to provide a full list of all the properties and interests they have.
So they might have them taken out to spend.
That has been a very critical focus of the ICC for a while now, actually, going 2 years to try and get a list of all the properties they own. But there was a very interesting cabinet decision that was made, I think, a couple of days ago, that land transactions in Kenya have been suspended pending the formation of a National Land Commission. And I do not know if there is a relation between this and that in this case, because Uhuru Kenyatta has been one of the biggest landowners in Kenya. We said to have over 500,000 acres of land. Ruto is also a big landowner, so it's not clear whether this is connected in any way.
Stop them from transferring.
It's not clear, but that has been that's a feature. That was a very interesting decision the cabinet took a few days ago.
All right, 500,000 acres. You're talking about around 800 square miles. Take us a little bit deeper on the implications, the ripples. Could they get back down to Kibaki and Raila Odinga? What could they actually mean as we move to the presidential election in 2013, possibly March, in Kenya?
Yes, they could, for various reasons. Like I talked about the structure of it, and one, the focus of the main two presidential candidates who are part of the ICC 4 now, who had directly and consistently mentioned Raila Odinga as the chief perpetrator of the violence, and that had been a major feature of their defense. And now that the charges are confirmed, really you're not going to spare anything in such a case. What may also happen, Kibaki is on his way out, so politically he has nothing to lose.
He's a retired man.
He's retiring at the end of this year. But there's two issues that come up here. One, there is for the violence, it appears that there is two perspectives to look at. The legal responsibility, which is now being undertaken by Honorable Ruto and Honorable Kenyatta, and the other two. And then there is the political responsibility, which lies with the public, which might eventually be borne by Prime Minister Raila Odinga. For the simple reason that, one, the tensions and emotions around the ICC process has been on a strong belief among certain segments of society that Mr. Odinga was the perpetrator. So Uhuru has had a huge control over the central Kenya vote, which is Kikuyu based, and which is probably the largest voting bloc, and votes in a straight file. Then William Ruto has emerged as the Kalenjin mouthpiece, and that's the second largest voting bloc in the country, and that is the bloc actually that elevated Odinga in the last general election to the post of Prime Minister, you could say, because the Prime Ministership was not contested for. It was a compromise position.
It did not even exist.
It didn't exist, but it is that Kalenjin vote that was able to propel him to a point where he could negotiate at that level. So these two votes really will the sense of belonging of our sons are likely, therefore, to vote in protest against Odinga. That
the Kalenjins could
and
because of Arab Sam, who's a Kalenjin, and
William Ruto, who's Kalenjin,
they could vote.
Mudahura, who is Meru, and very closely related. You say that the Meru and the Kikuyu are like the Gemas are probably like the Wachiga and the Nyankole. They are really essentially one and the same. Yes, that kind of access. So that vote is likely to vote directly, not just for their candidate, but against Honorable Odinga.
And that's quite big.
That's a huge vote to start against you in any election in the country. But that has also brought in very interesting scenarios where we have second-row candidates who are now being looked at as possible future strong contenders.
So could have new faces in
I believe we're going to have new faces. When you look at it from a continental perspective, a global perspective, we are most likely going to have new faces. Now, there has been a trend here. From the local level, Odinga comes from a dynasty, a political dynasty, the Odinga dynasty. His father was a vice president, and he's got brothers and family who have been MPs.
Oburu Odinga is in parliament.
Kenyatta comes from another political dynasty. And in all intents and purposes, you can see that probably they have reached or are going towards the beginning of their end. But when you look at politics across the continent, you find that in Egypt, it was Mubarak and sons, the dynasty. When you look at Libya, it was Gaddafi and sons,
which never came to pass.
When you look at Bahrain, it's a monarchy. When you look
at, you want to mention Uganda?
Everywhere it's been a monarchy. Now, the interesting aspect of it also is that the point of origin of all this anti-dynasty or anti-monarchy campaign was the U.S. When Obama emerged as a nobody, He overcome the Clinton dynasty.
Right.
Then he overcome the McCain dynasty. The McCain dynasty is a fourth generation military dynasty that was supported by the Bush dynasty. That was a distinct angle to that election. And then this move spread over to the Middle East and spread over to North Africa.
He's coming to
and what makes you think that Kenya is an exception? Because these dynasties have been in or around the center of power from 1963 to date. And in many ways, you can say that it is time for the Commentator's sons. You know, it's time for God's bits of wood, for the wretched of the earth to seek their lot and find a place where there can be compassion, where there can be fairness, where there can be equitable distribution of resources, where their voices can be heard. And maybe that's the direction that the politics of the world is taking. And that's just it, you know. Times will conspire. Circumstances will simply not work. For the first time in Kenya's history, we have Odinga's sister hauled in court to face corruption charges. This is unprecedented.
Right.
This has happened in January. For the first time in our history, we have the High Court determining the election date. This is unprecedented. This was an exclusivity of the president.
Right.
Within this month again, we have the Deputy Chief Justice being hauled before a tribunal for pinching the nose of a security guard who wanted to check her.
The lady with a bag.
Yes. This is in this one month. We have the Prime Minister's private secretary and advisor for legal and constitutional affairs literally writing a book exposing the Prime Minister's misdeeds.
Right.
These are simply non-conventional things that are indicators that there is a new beginning in the offing. These are the birth pangs before a new birth.
A new era.
A new era will come up there.
Well, in terms of the ICC, I think this is the first case in which the prosecutor has sought arrest warrants. He has gotten them. He's going to proceed to trial, because for many of the cases that he's had, there's been difficulties in getting to trial. The trial that we have going on right now before the ICC are the cases in Congo. Now, the Congo cases were referred by the UN Security Council.
Yes.
That's the only trial that has been going on at the ICC. So you're going to have another trial, which is initiated by the prosecutor on the basis of information coming through from the former UN Secretary General and several NGOs.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe before we get to hear from the listeners, there was a minority review, and Nicholas, Justice Hans-Peter Cole said this was not necessarily crimes against humanity. They could have been tried in Kenya. What is important is not a minority report of the court or a decision of the court. What is important is what actually becomes the court decision is the majority decision of the court. And that's why in every trial such as that you have an odd number, so that if there's a tie, there's a casting vote. Right.
So that minority decision may be disregarded.
All right. Well, listeners, this is Spectrum on Radio 1. Tonight, the ICC takes its stand, an important one on the Kenyan horror suspects. What are the implications on the Kenyan political scene and the key lessons for this, our beloved country? You can call in now. Our number 0414-348-111, 0312-260-390, When you call in, please tell us your name and where you're calling from. Also move some distance from your radio so we don't get feedback. Spectrum, hello? Hello? It seems there is a problem with those lines that has just emerged. We were not aware of it.
You know, incidentally, when the court was announcing its decision today, the court's website crashed. So I hope you guys had it.
Yeah, well, I was still
the entire world.
The entire world.
Yes. So much shut down.
Amazing. Mark, I thought it was only in Kenya. Spectrum, hello? Hello? Please talk to us. You're live on Spectrum. Alright. Okay. Let's move on. There seems to be a problem with those lines. Let's carry on in the studio. Hello? Hello? Yes, sir, your name?
Hello? How are you?
Very well, thank you. Your name?
Is this radio?
Yes, it is.
My name is Musina Crimson.
Busin.
The resident of Kampala and a follower of Kenya political affairs. My simple question is, I see as if this verdict of court having come at a wrong time when Kenya is heading for another election. Don't you think may have a negative impact on the election results in a way that whatever results that come out, they may be contested by different groups or tribes, and we may go again into the acrimony that was there in 2007. I have a fear that an election is going to be now conducted along terrible lines, and we may have a repeat of 2007. That's my fear. Thank you.
Spectrum, hello?
Yes, please. To me,
yes.
You see, for long and long, we as people who have deeper love and attachment for African nations, we have advocated for Africans that once a country which is an icon of Africa like Kenya fails to build its judicial institutions, its institutions that govern the whole country, then it will fall prey to international institutions which will take advantage of it. Now look at this Hague Kenyan scene. Really, I want you to draw a picture. If the Kenyan judicial institution, the political arm had built it, had given it all the infrastructure and investigative powers, now these gentlemen, these political heads, would decide in the local system of Kenya, which is feasible and has all the knowledge of Kenyan political process. But now since that building of these institutions failed, now our leaders are going to fall prey of the Hague institution, which has no reality on African local politics. To me, Max, goodbye.
Listeners, you can also send us your text messages. Type the word Spectrum in your phone browser. Question, message, or comment. Send it to 7197. I'll say that again. Spectrum, space, message, question, or comment. Send it to 7197.
Hello?
Yes, sir, your name?
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Emmanuel Samirike, and I have one simple question. From what has been happening in Kenya and other African countries around the issue of elected democracy, isn't it time for us to reflect on this whole concept of the world view of democracy and relate it to our contemporary African setting? Is it really a uniting factor, and does it take into consideration as we move towards national cohesion, or actually a disuniting issue? Thank you so much.
Spectrum, hello.
Hello, good evening, good morning.
Good evening, your name?
AM as usual.
Yes,
my brief. I think Kenya, the international court gave them enough time to the judicial system of Kenya, but they were a bit reluctant because they gave them enough time. But I think justice prevailing. We should just wait and see the final. Thank you.
All right, let's get back to the studio. Mr. Gwada.
Yes.
Well, you can respond.
Well, there's one issue that has been brought up in regard to the entire ICC process, all the geopolitics, the international politics that has been raised. But as Emmanuel correctly says, the ICC gave ample time to the Kenyan political parties. And let's get to the genesis of the problem.
The Kenyan political parties?
Yes, and the Kenyan government. They gave the Kenyan government an opportunity to take or to show some responsibility towards what had happened in 2007. Parliament refused to form a local tribunal. But in essence, how did we get to the ICC? The ODM political party wrote a huge dossier incriminating the PNU and took it to the Hague.
That's Kibaki's party, yes?
The PNU party also wrote a huge dossier incriminating the ODM party in the violence.
Yes.
So both these parties went to the Hague and literally schooled on each other. Right. They set each other up.
Right.
Now, the ICC has been operating on the premise of the dossier that they received from these two antagonists.
True.
So it was only much later that they began to realize that they had set each other up and that there was no way out of it because the process had begun. Two, Busingi has raised the issue of justice and timing. I think justice makes no appointment. It's not the issue of timing, it's the issue of justice. Because there are people in my country who are cannot completely be given a fair hearing in a court of law. This is historical.
Yes.
The law in my country has applied to the poor exclusively because a very rich cabal had developed and completely taken over control of certain institutions, which are now currently the focus of change, like the judiciary, the security apparatus, the financial sector, the energy sector. Now, all through, we have not had a single case, in spite of all the evidence that there has been about corruption, about all forms of vice in society. Nobody has been successfully prosecuted and punished for these things. So there had been a complete lack of seriousness or focus by the governments of the day. Every single evidence that was gotten, power became the ultimate goal, not justice. So every single evidence or every single commission that had been appointed that came up with evidence was used as a political ploy to untwist votes or to get people to join your side at the expense of the numerous voters or the victims who had been hurt. Right. Now the ICC currently, and the president of the ICC has made this very clear, that the focus of the ICC is on the victims, and insofar as there are victims, the process will continue. And there is evidence that there are so many victims. I think in today's Nation newspapers, one man who lost 11 family members who were locked up and burnt in a house was being looked for and has disappeared. Right. And these are, I mean, many people do not know the extent. Right. This man had his family, he was Luo, he had his family locked up in a house and burnt completely to ashes. Right. On the other hand, in Eldoret, a church, women and children fled and hid in a church. Yes. And they met their fate there. And some people went and set the church on fire. And as children and people were jumping out of the window, right, these people threw them back. Right. I mean, these are scenes or scenarios that had only occurred during the Hitlerist days. Right. I mean, and there needed to be a certain way to stop this. Now, I may not completely agree with certain elements of how the case has gone, but I agree and I must support any action that will bring sobriety, justice, and bring justice to the people of my country. So it's a golden opportunity for Kenya to have justice. Kenya needs to review its future, particularly from its past and some of the actions of the leadership. There must be a way where certain people must be held accountable before the courts of law. The law must prevail. Nicholas.
So there's this argument about the ICC targeting African leaders and African situations, and then the insinuation that Africans must find African solutions to African problems, and that the ICC is an extension of a foreign power, prevailing over African countries. But the fact that we can't deny is that Africa has had these situations. They have been victims in all these countries, in Libya, in Uganda, northern Uganda, in Chad, in Congo, in Liberia as well. So we haven't really denied the fact that these gruesome things happen in our country. But also, secondly, the fact that the ICC isn't a court that began in 2005 alone. It's a continuation of a development of its national legal system. We've had tribunals in Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. So it's been a continuous process in which the entire world has been subject to, right from the time of the Hitler trials. Right. I think that argument is flawed. And there cannot be an African solution to African problems in a society or in a world in which the world is interconnected, in which values are shared, in which systems, because these countries are members of the UN, are members, many of them are actually signatories to the Rome Statute, yes, and they've got to be held to these obligations that they signed up to, wherever they are. There should be no excuse about African problems to African solutions. All right, we have to go, but maybe just before we go, what kind of sentences are they likely to get, and how long is the trial likely to be, Nicholas? Now, in terms of sentencing, first and foremost, it's important to know that at the ICC, there's no death penalty.